The strange thing about losing someone isn't the goodbye. It's the moment they come back and expect to find the same version of you still waiting. Take your hand off him. The words cut cleanly through the crowded gallery, calm enough to silence every nearby conversation without rising above a normal speaking voice. Ethan Brooks froze with his sketchbook still tucked beneath one arm as the room seemed to pause around him. The bright lights hanging from the exposed brick ceiling reflected off polished concrete floors. Glasses of sparkling water hovered halfway to smiling lips, and somewhere across the room a jazz trio continued playing as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But everything had changed. Asher Collins still had one hand wrapped gently around Ethan's wrist, wearing the same confident smile that had once convinced Ethan to believe impossible promises. 3 years had passed since their relationship ended, yet Asher looked almost untouched by time. The tailored navy jacket, the perfectly styled dark hair, the effortless charm that could make strangers trust him within minutes. It was all exactly the same. Ethan wished he could say the same about himself. His heartbeat stumbled as another familiar presence stepped closer. Landon Hayes didn't raise his voice. He didn't look angry. He simply moved until he stood beside Ethan, close enough that Ethan caught the clean scent of cedar and fresh laundry drifting from his charcoal overcoat. Landon's expression remained unreadable, his blue eyes fixed entirely on Asher. He said he just wanted to talk. Ethan managed quietly, though he wasn't sure whether he was explaining the situation to Landon or reminding himself why he hadn't already walked away. Asher chuckled softly. "We're adults, aren't we? I figured we deserved one honest conversation." Landon never looked away from him. Not if he doesn't want one. The gallery suddenly felt much smaller. Conversations faded into cautious whispers. Someone nearby pretended to study a watercolor landscape while clearly listening. Ethan hated being the center of attention. He always had. Asher finally glanced toward Landon with polite curiosity. "And you are?" Before Landon could answer, Ethan noticed something that made his chest tighten. Landon's hand wasn't reaching for him. It wasn't trying to pull him away or make a dramatic statement. Instead, it rested loosely at his own side, leaving Ethan complete freedom to step closer or walk away. The choice was entirely his. That simple restraint somehow made Ethan feel safer than any grand gesture ever could. Asher's smile thinned almost imperceptibly. "Interesting." Landon spoke with the same steady tone. Let go of his wrist. Silence settled between them. Ethan looked down as if seeing the unwanted contact for the first time. He hadn't even realized how tense his shoulders had become until that moment. Slowly, Asher released him, though amusement still lingered in his eyes. "Looks like you've made a new friend." Ethan opened his mouth, searching for words that refused to come. Before anyone spoke again, everything around him blurred into the echo of memories he had spent months trying to bury. Memories that had begun exactly 3 weeks earlier, on a quiet Tuesday morning, when he believed the hardest chapter of his life had already ended. 3 weeks earlier, Ethan Brooks believed he had finally learned how to enjoy quiet mornings. His studio apartment above a neighborhood bookstore overlooked a narrow street lined with maple trees that had just begun turning gold. Every Tuesday, he carried a sketchbook and a travel mug of vanilla latte across the block to the same corner cafe before opening his tiny illustration studio at 9 o'clock sharp. Routine felt safe, predictable, honest. After everything that had happened with Asher, ordinary days had become their own kind of victory. The bell above the cafe door chimed as Ethan stepped inside, greeted by the familiar aroma of fresh pastries and roasted coffee beans. "The usual?" the barista asked with a smile. Ethan nodded gratefully. "Please." He found his favorite seat beside the window, opened his sketchbook, and began outlining ideas for a children's picture book commission. Soft pencil strokes slowly replaced the anxious thoughts that still visited him from time to time. He almost smiled when a shadow stretched across the page. "Still drawing tiny dragons?" a warm voice asked. Ethan looked up and blinked. The stranger standing beside the table was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a charcoal business coat with the sleeves rolled back just enough to reveal a silver watch. His blonde hair was slightly windswept, as though he had walked several blocks instead of driving. Most noticeable, however, were his eyes. Calm, steady, curious without being intrusive. Ethan realized he had been staring too long. "Sorry." The man looked down at the sketchbook. I saw the little dragon on the corner of your page. My niece would probably ask for 50 stickers if she owned that book. Ethan laughed before he could stop himself. That is surprisingly accurate. Landon Hayes, the stranger said, extending a hand. Ethan accepted it. The handshake was brief, polite, and completely unhurried. Ethan Brooks. Nice to meet you, Ethan. Their conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. They talked about coffee, children's books, and how impossible it was to find parking downtown after 10 in the morning. Nothing dramatic happened. No instant sparks. No unbelievable coincidence. Yet after Landon left with a quiet wave, Ethan noticed something strange. The cafe suddenly felt a little brighter. He shook his head at himself. Get a grip, he muttered under his breath. He was just being friendly. The following Tuesday, Landon appeared again, this time carrying 2 coffees. I guessed vanilla latte, he admitted. If I guessed wrong, I owe you another one. Ethan accepted the cup with a surprised smile. You remembered? Landon shrugged lightly. You looked happy drinking it last week. Such a simple answer should not have lingered in Ethan's mind for the rest of the day. But it did. Because after years of confusing grand promises with genuine care, he had almost forgotten what quiet kindness looked like. Neither of them noticed the man sitting inside a black sedan across the street, watching through tinted windows before quietly lowering his phone and driving away. The weeks settled into a rhythm that Ethan never expected to miss on the rare mornings Landon was traveling for work. Tuesday coffees quietly became Wednesday lunches, then unexpected Friday walks through the weekend farmers market where Landon somehow managed to remember every small detail Ethan casually mentioned. He remembered that Ethan preferred honey over sugar, that he always slowed down to admire flower stands, and that he could never resist buying another notebook even when half a dozen blank ones were already waiting on the shelf at home. Nobody had ever paid attention to those little things before. It was both comforting and terrifying. Ethan caught himself smiling more often, usually at moments when nobody else was looking. His neighbors noticed first. Mrs. Alvarez from the bookstore downstairs leaned across the register one afternoon and grinned knowingly. You have that look. Ethan blinked. What look? The one people get when someone makes them laugh before they even arrive. Ethan nearly dropped the stack of postcards in his hands. We are just friends. She laughed softly. That was not my question. He carried those words with him all afternoon. Friends. That was safe. Friends did not complicate life. Friends did not leave without warning. Friends did not make promises they never intended to keep. Every time those old fears surfaced, Landon unintentionally erased them with another simple act of kindness. He never interrupted Ethan while he was sketching. He always asked before entering the studio workspace. If Ethan looked tired, Landon suggested ending their evening early instead of insisting they stay out longer. There was never pressure, never expectation. Just quiet respect that wrapped around Ethan like a warm sweater on a chilly October evening. One rainy Thursday, Landon appeared outside the studio carrying 2 umbrellas even though he only needed one. Weather apps said this would last another hour. He said with an apologetic smile. I figured you forgot yours. Ethan stared at the second umbrella before looking up. How did you know? Landon smiled. You always leave it leaning beside your drafting table whenever the forecast changes after breakfast. Ethan laughed in disbelief. You notice everything. Only the things that matter. The words were spoken so naturally that Landon himself seemed unaware of how deeply they landed. Ethan looked away first, pretending to adjust the strap of his messenger bag because suddenly meeting those calm blue eyes felt impossible. Across the street, a familiar black sedan remained parked between 2 maple trees. The driver watched quietly from behind dark sunglasses, fingers resting against the steering wheel without moving. Asher Collins had spent the last several days convincing himself that the blond man accompanying Ethan was simply another passing acquaintance. Yet every photograph he quietly captured told a different story. There was no dramatic affection, no obvious romance, only comfortable silence, shared laughter, and the unmistakable ease of 2 people who genuinely enjoyed being together. Somehow that unsettled Asher more than anything else could have. He slipped his phone into his jacket pocket and whispered to himself, You moved on faster than I expected. But the tightness in his voice betrayed the truth. He did not believe those words at all. He started the engine, pulled away from the curb, and decided it was finally time to remind Ethan that unfinished stories had a way of finding their endings whether anyone wanted them to or not. Saturday mornings usually belonged to the downtown farmers market, and Ethan had quietly accepted that Landon would probably be waiting near the flower stalls before he even arrived. Somehow it had become their tradition without either of them officially suggesting it. Landon insisted he only came for fresh bread. Ethan insisted he only came for the watercolor postcards. Neither of them believed the other anymore, and somehow that made both of them smile. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of cinnamon pastries and roasted pecans while local musicians filled the sidewalks with soft acoustic melodies. Ethan wandered between colorful displays of pumpkins and handmade pottery, occasionally stopping to sketch tiny details that caught his attention. Landon followed at an easy pace, never rushing him, never asking why he spent 5 full minutes drawing a single sunflower. He simply waited, hands tucked inside the pockets of his coat, looking perfectly content to exist beside him. "You know," Landon said after Ethan finally closed his sketchbook, "you notice beautiful things before everyone else does." Ethan laughed quietly. "I think I just walk slower." "Maybe," Landon smiled. "Or maybe everyone else walks too fast." Before Ethan could answer, his phone vibrated inside his jacket. An unfamiliar number flashed across the screen. He almost ignored it before curiosity won. "Hello." Silence greeted him for only a heartbeat. Then a voice he recognized immediately. "Still hanging up on unknown numbers?" Ethan stopped walking. Every sound around him seemed to fade beneath the weight of one familiar sentence. "Asher." Landon glanced toward him, instantly noticing the change in Ethan's expression without asking a single question. "I figured you would recognize my voice eventually," Asher said gently. "Can we talk?" Ethan stared at the pavement. Fallen maple leaves shifted across the sidewalk beneath a cool breeze. "I do not think there is anything left to say." "There is for me." Ethan closed his eyes. "Goodbye, Asher." He ended the call before his hands could begin shaking. He slipped the phone back into his pocket, hoping Landon had not noticed. He had. "Everything okay?" Landon asked softly. Ethan forced a smile that fooled absolutely no one. "Wrong number." Landon held his gaze for a brief moment, then nodded. "If you ever decide it was not a wrong number, you do not have to explain anything until you are ready." That was all he said. No questions, no pressure, no attempts to solve a problem Ethan had not asked him to solve. Somehow that quiet trust made Ethan's chest ache even more. The following Monday morning, a bouquet of white lilies appeared outside Ethan's studio door with a handwritten card tucked carefully between the stems. "I never stopped believing we could find our way back." Ethan did not need to read the signature. His stomach had already recognized it before his eyes did. He carried the flowers inside only long enough to place them beside the trash bin, unsure why throwing them away felt harder than it should have. Less than an hour later, another delivery arrived. This time, it was a small box containing his favorite blueberry muffins from the bakery Asher used to visit with him years ago. The note simply read, "I remember." Ethan quietly closed the lid. Across the street, hidden behind the reflection of a coffee shop window, Asher watched the studio entrance with patient confidence. He smiled to himself, believing memories were stronger than new beginnings. He had no idea that someone else had already begun building something far more difficult to break. By the end of the week, Ethan convinced himself the flowers and gifts would stop if he simply refused to respond. He blocked one phone number, only for another unfamiliar number to appear the following afternoon. He ignored every message without reading past the first line. Silence, he hoped, would eventually become an answer. Instead, the quiet only seemed to encourage Asher's determination. On Friday evening, Ethan locked the studio door later than usual after finishing the final illustrations for his picture book. The sidewalks glowed beneath rows of warm string lights as nearby restaurants filled with the sound of laughter drifting into the cool autumn air. He adjusted the strap of his messenger bag and started toward the parking garage 3 blocks away. Halfway across the square, he heard someone call his name. "Ethan." His steps slowed before he could stop himself. Asher stood beside the stone fountain in the center of the plaza, hands resting inside the pockets of a camel-colored coat, looking more nervous than Ethan had ever seen him. "Please," Asher said quietly. 5 minutes. Ethan remained several feet away. "You should not be here." "I know." Asher nodded once. but I also know you would never answer my calls. Ethan looked toward the street, calculating how quickly he could leave without making a scene. What do you want? Asher exhaled slowly. An honest chance to apologize. Ethan almost laughed, although nothing about the moment felt amusing. You already had that chance. Not like this. There was a long silence between them. Water rippled softly through the fountain, while couples wandered past carrying shopping bags and paper cups filled with hot chocolate. The entire city seemed to continue breathing as though Ethan's world had not suddenly become impossibly complicated again. I was afraid, Asher admitted. I kept choosing work because I thought there would always be time for us later. By the time I realized what I had lost, you were already gone. Ethan lowered his eyes. Once upon a time, those words would have shattered every wall around his heart. Now they simply made him tired. You did not lose me, he said softly. You let me go over and over until eventually I stopped reaching back. Asher took one careful step closer, but stopped when Ethan instinctively shifted backward. The movement lasted less than a second, yet it changed everything. Asher noticed it. Ethan noticed that Asher noticed it. Neither of them spoke. Has someone else taken my place? Asher finally asked. Ethan hesitated. Images of Tuesday mornings, shared coffee cups, quiet smiles, and patient conversations flickered through his mind. He still did not know what any of it meant, only that thinking about Landon made him feel unexpectedly calm. That is not the point, Ethan answered honestly. Maybe not. Asher offered a sad smile. But I think I already know the answer. Before Ethan could respond, another familiar voice drifted gently across the plaza. I was hoping I was not too late. Ethan turned. Landon approached carrying 2 paper cups, his coat catching the evening breeze as he crossed the sidewalk. He slowed the instant he recognized the man standing opposite Ethan. His expression remained composed, but his eyes quietly assessed the situation before settling on Ethan alone. Everything okay? He asked. Ethan looked from Asher to Landon, suddenly realizing that the decision he had been avoiding for weeks was no longer something the future would solve for him. It had quietly arrived, carrying 2 cups of coffee and the weight of everything he had not yet found the courage to say. For one suspended moment, nobody moved. The paper cups in Landon's hands released thin ribbons of steam that disappeared into the cool evening air, while the fountain continued its quiet rhythm behind them. Ethan felt as though the entire plaza had narrowed until only the 3 of them remained. Landon looked at Ethan first, never at Asher. Do you want me to leave? He asked gently. The question caught Ethan off guard. There was no jealousy in Landon's voice, no demand for an explanation, only a simple invitation for Ethan to decide what happened next. Ethan swallowed. No. It came out softer than he intended, but it was enough. Landon gave one small nod and stepped closer, stopping beside Ethan instead of in front of him. The choice felt deliberate, protective without being possessive. Asher noticed it immediately. So, Asher said with a careful smile, this is the reason you have been avoiding me. Ethan shook his head. No, I have been avoiding you because I needed peace. The words settled between them with surprising weight. Asher looked down briefly before lifting his eyes again. I know I made mistakes. You did, Ethan answered quietly. But this is not about punishment. It is about realizing I cannot keep living inside memories that only one of us wanted to fix after they were already broken. Asher's shoulders fell. I thought if I reminded you of everything we shared. You did remind me, Ethan interrupted with a sad smile. You reminded me how much energy I spent hoping things would change. Silence followed. A couple walked past carrying shopping bags, laughing about something completely unrelated, and Ethan found himself envying how ordinary their evening seemed. Landon remained perfectly still beside him, never interrupting, never speaking over him. His quiet presence made it easier to keep going. Asher finally looked toward Landon. You seem very confident. Landon met his gaze calmly. No, I am simply listening to Ethan. And if he changes his mind? Asher asked. Then I will respect it. Ethan turned toward Landon, surprised by the certainty in that answer. There was no attempt to win, no competition, no performance, just trust. It made something inside Ethan loosen for the first time in years. Asher let out a slow breath and stepped closer, stopping several feet away. Could I at least shake your hand before I go? He asked Ethan. Ethan hesitated, uncertain whether accepting the gesture would reopen wounds he had worked so hard to close. Before he could answer, Asher reached forward instinctively, his hand brushing toward Ethan's wrist. The movement was brief and harmless, but Landon reacted without hesitation. He stepped forward just enough to create space, his voice remaining calm, steady, and impossible to misunderstand. "Please do not." Asher paused. Landon's eyes never left his. "He has already told you what he wants." The evening seemed to fall completely silent. Even the music drifting from a nearby restaurant faded into the background. After a long moment, Asher slowly lowered his hand. He studied Ethan's face one last time and, for the first time since returning, seemed to truly see the quiet confidence that had replaced the uncertainty he once depended on. Asher gave a small, resigned nod. "I think I finally understand." Without another word, he turned and disappeared into the crowd, leaving Ethan staring after him until the familiar figure was gone. Only then did Ethan release the breath he had been holding. Beside him, Landon quietly held out one of the coffee cups with an almost apologetic smile. "I hope it is still warm." Ethan accepted it, his fingers brushing the paper cup before lifting grateful eyes toward the man who had never once tried to choose for him, only stood beside him until he found the courage to choose for himself. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The evening breeze carried the scent of roasted chestnuts from a nearby street vendor, while tiny lights hanging above the plaza shimmered against the deep blue sky. Ethan realized he was still holding his breath. Landon did not look at Asher again. He only watched Ethan with quiet concern, as though the only answer that mattered belonged to him. "Do you want me to stay?" Landon asked gently. The question was so simple that it almost brought tears to Ethan's eyes. There was no demand hidden inside it. No expectation. Only a choice. Ethan nodded before he even realized he had made the decision. "Yes." The word barely rose above a whisper, yet it seemed louder than every conversation surrounding them. Asher lowered his eyes for a brief moment before offering a tired smile. "I guess that answers everything." Ethan swallowed hard. "I never wanted to hurt you." "I know." Asher let out a quiet laugh that carried more regret than humor. "The truth is, I spent years assuming you would always be there whenever I decided I was ready." He looked toward the glowing fountain before continuing. "I kept believing love could wait." Ethan remembered every lonely birthday, every canceled dinner, every promise postponed until someday. Those memories no longer burned. They simply felt distant, like photographs left too long beneath the sun. "It cannot," Ethan answered softly. "Some things disappear while we are busy waiting." Asher nodded slowly, accepting the words without argument. "I think I finally understand that." Silence settled once more, but this time it felt peaceful instead of heavy. Asher slipped both hands into his coat pockets and took one careful step backward. "I really am sorry, Ethan." Ethan believed him. That surprised him more than anything else. The apology arrived years too late, but it was honest. Somehow that honesty allowed the last fragile thread connecting them to loosen at last. "I hope you find happiness," Ethan said. Asher smiled, small and genuine. "I hope you already have." With one final glance, he turned and disappeared into the evening crowd until his familiar silhouette blended among strangers and was finally gone. Ethan watched until he could not see him anymore. Only then did he notice how strangely light his chest felt, as though he had been carrying a suitcase without realizing how heavy it had become. Beside him, Landon quietly handed over one of the paper coffee cups he had been holding the entire time. "It is probably cold now," he admitted with an apologetic smile. Ethan accepted it anyway, wrapping both hands around the cup. "I think it is perfect." They began walking without deciding where to go. Their footsteps echoed softly along the brick sidewalk, while storefront windows reflected the warm glow of passing streetlights. After several quiet blocks, Ethan finally spoke. "You never asked who he was." Landon smiled faintly. "I figured you would tell me when you were ready." Ethan looked ahead, blinking back unexpected emotion. "He was the person I thought I would spend my future with." Landon listened without interrupting. But somewhere along the way, Ethan continued. "I stopped missing him and started missing the person I used to be before everything became so complicated." Landon slowed his pace. "Then maybe," he said softly, "you have not been searching for your past at all. Maybe you have been finding yourself again." Ethan stopped walking. Those words settled somewhere deep inside him, filling a space he had not realized was still empty. For the first time in years, the future no longer felt like something he needed to survive. It quietly began to feel like somewhere he actually wanted to go, especially if the man standing beside him kept choosing to walk there too. The following Tuesday arrived wrapped in pale morning sunlight that spilled across the windows of Ethan's studio, turning scattered pencils and watercolor palettes into tiny streaks of gold. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he unlocked the front door without checking over his shoulder. The silence no longer felt like something waiting to break. It felt peaceful. He spent the morning finishing the final pages of his picture book, humming softly without realizing it until Mrs. Alvarez stepped inside, carrying a paper bag from the bakery downstairs. She raised one amused eyebrow. "You were singing." Ethan blinked. "Was I?" "You were." She smiled knowingly as she placed 2 cinnamon rolls on the work table. "That is how I know your heart has finally stopped arguing with itself." Ethan laughed, shaking his head. "You always make everything sound like it belongs in a novel. Life usually does." She patted his shoulder before leaving as quietly as she had arrived. Ethan looked down at the warm pastry and smiled to himself. An hour later, the familiar bell above the studio door chimed once. He looked up automatically, expecting a client. Instead, Landon stepped inside carrying a flat cardboard portfolio case almost as large as the table. "I hope I am not interrupting." Ethan felt his face brighten before he could stop it. "Never." Landon set the case down carefully. "I have something for you." Ethan opened it slowly and froze. Inside were professionally printed samples of his illustrations mounted on elegant display boards, along with brochures introducing his upcoming gallery exhibition. Every detail had been arranged with remarkable care, from the typography to the paper quality. Ethan looked up in disbelief. "You did this?" Landon rubbed the back of his neck, suddenly looking far less confident than the composed attorney everyone else knew. "I asked a designer friend for help. I thought your work deserved to be seen the way I already see it." Ethan swallowed hard. "Landon, I know I should have asked first." Landon gave an embarrassed smile. "If you hate them, we can start over." Ethan stepped closer, running his fingertips lightly across one of the mounted illustrations. "I do not hate them." His voice trembled despite himself. "Nobody has ever believed in my work this much." Landon answered quietly. "I have." The room fell wonderfully still. Outside, traffic drifted through the street below, while somewhere nearby a church bell marked the passing hour. Ethan looked into Landon's steady blue eyes and suddenly understood something that had been growing between them for weeks. It had never been built from dramatic speeches or impossible promises. It had been built from remembered coffee orders, spare umbrellas, patient silences, and the simple habit of always showing up. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan whispered. Landon nodded. "Anything." Ethan took one careful breath. "Why me?" Landon smiled with gentle honesty. "Because every room feels quieter when you leave it. Because you notice beauty where everyone else walks past. Because you thank waiters by name, rescue abandoned sketchbooks from thrift stores, and somehow make ordinary Tuesdays feel like something worth looking forward to." Ethan laughed through the tears gathering in his eyes. "That is a very long answer. I have been keeping it to myself for months." They both smiled. Ethan closed the portfolio case and placed it gently on the table before taking a single step forward. This time there was no fear, no confusion, and no shadow from the past standing between them. He reached out first, carefully slipping his hand into Landon's. Their fingers fit together with effortless certainty. "I think," Ethan said softly, "I have been looking forward to this moment longer than I realized." Landon's smile became brighter than Ethan had ever seen. "So have I." Neither of them hurried the silence that followed, because sometimes the beginning of something real sounded exactly like 2 hearts finally finding the courage to beat toward the same future. 3 months later, the downtown gallery glowed beneath warm evening lights, its white walls filled with watercolor worlds that had once existed only inside Ethan's sketchbooks. Families wandered slowly from painting to painting. Children pointed excitedly at friendly dragons and woodland creatures, and quiet conversations floated through the room like gentle music. Ethan stood near the entrance greeting guests, still unable to believe that every illustration hanging around him belonged to the life he had nearly convinced himself was too small to matter. A framed card beside the final collection carried a simple title: New Beginnings. Mrs. Alvarez dabbed the corner of one eye with a handkerchief before pretending she had something in her eye. I have known artists with twice your confidence and half your heart, she whispered. Never lose the second one. Ethan hugged her gratefully before another guest approached to ask for an autograph. Even now, signing his own name beneath a printed book cover felt wonderfully unreal. Across the room, Landon stood speaking with one of the gallery sponsors. His suit was as perfectly tailored as always, yet every few moments his attention drifted back toward Ethan without him even realizing it. Each time their eyes met, the same quiet smile returned as naturally as breathing. Nothing about it felt dramatic anymore. It simply felt like home. Later that evening, after the final visitors began filtering out into the cool night air, Ethan wandered toward the last painting hanging alone at the end of the exhibition. It showed two figures walking side by side beneath rows of autumn trees, their faces turned away from the viewer as golden leaves drifted around them. They were not holding hands in the painting. There was only a comfortable distance between them, leaving space for the future instead of forcing it. Landon stepped quietly beside him. I have been looking at this one all night, he admitted. Ethan smiled. Most people think it is the simplest piece in the room. It is. Landon nodded. That is why it says the most. Ethan looked up at him. Do you know something funny? What? When I first painted it, I thought it was about letting someone go. He laughed softly. Now I realize it was about walking toward someone instead. Landon reached for Ethan's hand, giving him every chance to step away if he wanted to. Instead, Ethan closed the distance himself, their fingers fitting together with the same effortless certainty as before. Outside the gallery windows, the city shimmered beneath thousands of tiny lights, while the first cool breeze of late autumn carried another season quietly into their lives. Ethan rested his head lightly against Landon's shoulder for a brief, peaceful moment. Thank you, he whispered. For what? For never asking me to become someone else before you chose to stay. Landon's smile softened. I never fell in love with the person you might become. His voice remained calm and certain. I fell in love with the man who kept creating beautiful things even after the world gave him reasons to stop. Ethan felt his eyes sting again, but this time the tears carried no sadness at all. Months earlier, he had believed the hardest part of losing love was being left behind. Standing there beside the man who had quietly walked into his ordinary Tuesdays and transformed them into something extraordinary, he finally understood the truth. The hardest part had never been losing the wrong person. It had been believing he did not deserve the right one. As the gallery lights dimmed one by one and the doors closed behind the final guests, Ethan and Landon stepped out together into the quiet evening. Not racing toward tomorrow, not trying to rewrite yesterday, but simply choosing, with every unhurried step, to keep walking the same road side by side.